Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome two authors to join us this evening. We are here to celebrate the release of Jamie Ducharme's new book, The Impressively Researched Account of the History and Rise of E-Cigarettes in Big Vape, The Incendiary Rise of Juul. Excuse me. She is joined by her colleague at Time, the Time magazine editor at large, Jeffrey Kluger, who is the author of several previous books, including Apollo 13 and the upcoming Holdout. Thank you to the two of you for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having us.
So while we get started, why don't you tell me very quickly, give me an elevator pitch of your books. Jamie, give me an elevator pitch, real quick summary of what the Big Vape is about.
Sure. So Big Vape traces the rise of the company Juul Labs, which is an e-cigarette company founded to give smokers a better alternative to cigarettes, founded by two Stanford graduate students who were smokers themselves. But if you've read any news coverage about Juul in the last 3 years, you probably know that it instead took off among teenagers and got many a teenager addicted to nicotine, attracted the interest of a big tobacco company that invested $13 billion and sort of drew the ire of many people in the public health world. So the book traces what Juul could have been, what it turned out to be, and where it might go next.
Thank you. And Jeffrey, can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming novel, Holdout?
Holdout is a story about an American astronaut who refuses to come home from the International Space Station when her time is up. There's been an accident aboard the station. The crew has to evacuate, and she refuses to leave. She cites the words of Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. When asked why she's not going to leave, she says, "I would prefer not to." But she has a reason, and her reason is to undo a profound injustice on Earth. And from her perch on the International Space Station, she hopes to mobilize a global movement in order to right a grievous wrong.
Excellent. So we paired the two of you. You both work together at Time Magazine. We titled this event, Don't Smoke in Space, which I'm sure astronauts are not allowed to smoke in the International Space Station. Both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Jamie is going to be making a trip to Concord in the next few weeks. So if you order a copy and just type in the order notes that you'd like us to hold it for her to sign, we're happy to do that. And Jeffrey's book is coming out in a few weeks, and pre-orders are one of the best ways you can tell a publisher pay attention to this book. So both of these books are available from Gibson's. We are happy to ship, do curbside pickup, and we are open for in-store browsing. I'm going to hand this event over to the two of you. Thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Okay, well, I think since Jamie's book is out first, and Jamie's book is one that I think is doing a great deal of social good, I want to start with a question that it's one of the ones we discussed earlier, and I think it goes to the heart of the book, which is, did the creators of Juul really set out to do good, to right a wrong by giving smokers an alternative to cigarettes, or did they just set out to make a boatload of money?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I'm asked a lot and have thought about a lot. And I think the answer, which is a little unsatisfying, is that it was both. I mean, these guys were smokers themselves, so they clearly understood the problem of smoking and wanting to quit and not being able to quit and not finding a product that could help them do that. And I really do think that they wanted to give people like themselves a better option, something that hopefully would not kill them, for one thing, and that could deliver nicotine in a hopefully safer way, but still be appealing enough that people would use it. But with that said, you know, these guys met in a product design program, not a public health program. So they were out to make a product that would sell well, that would be profitable, that would be, you know, appealing and that people would want to use. And I think health was part of their goal, but it wasn't the entire goal. So the money and the business proposition was always going hand in hand with the public health value of the product. And I think as the company grew and started to rake in some dubious customers, I think the money started to perhaps take precedence for some people there.
And do you think there was a point then, at least to hear Juul's detractors tell it, and Juul has an abundance of detractors now, it went from being a possible public health boon to being a public health nightmare? And at what point do you think that happened? And is the answer really that binary? Did it go, is there anything good about this product?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you phrased it that way, because I think there is something good about the product. The data is pretty clear that e-cigarettes are not good for you, but they are better than cigarettes. So if there's a segment of the smoking population that uses these products instead of regular cigarettes, that's a good thing. We don't know how they affect the body over decades and decades because they haven't been around that long, but at least in the short term, I think it's not too controversial to say it's a better option. So the interesting thing is that enough teenagers and enough people who used e-cigarettes recreationally started using this product that became all anyone could talk about. And I think a lot of people do forget that there were some adult smokers who were using this product the way it was meant to be used and finding value in it. And that just sort of got lost in all of the frantic media coverage about addicted teenagers at school. So I think that's important to say, but to answer your question of sort of where things start to go off the tracks, I think it's honestly as soon as the product launched, which was in 2015, they came out with this really flashy launch campaign, Times Square billboards and Instagram posts and colorful ads with models like dancing around and holding Juuls. And it just does not look like the way a responsible company would market an addictive nicotine product. It looks like they wanted it to be trendy and cool. And the company has said many times that campaign wasn't that successful. It didn't drive sales too much at first, but I think what it did is it established a reputation for Juul as a company that had these sort of murky motives and maybe was out to get the wrong people. And that campaign really gave the public health world ammunition for years to come when when teenagers did start to use the product, they could point back and say, here's where it started, and this was on purpose.
Right. And what about the medical consensus? I mean, there are doctors certainly who currently believe that Juul is a good idea, but I'm sure you could also find an equal cohort of doctors who say this is a terrible idea. So where do the doctors break down, and where do you break down or where do you come down in assessing the doctors' points of view on this?
Yeah, I don't think there is much of a medical consensus. As you rightly point out, there are two really passionate camps on this issue. You can find probably an equal number of doctors who think that e-cigarettes could change the face of public health and help make cigarettes obsolete, as you can find people who think they're just horrible and introducing new health problems and getting new people addicted to nicotine. So that debate is something that I found fascinating as I reported the book. Just there's no clear answer on how bad or how good these products are for you. And there's tons of studies to support both arguments. So I tend to come down on this. This is not a hot take. I think that you shouldn't inhale anything into your lungs if you don't have to. Obviously, you should not use this if you're not a smoker. But I do think, based on the studies that I've read, it's safer enough than cigarettes that it has a place for people who are already smoking.
Right. Was there anything in the story? I find when I'm deep in research like this, there is often something that if it doesn't make my jaw drop, it certainly makes my eyes open. And it's the kind of thing that I will share at my next cocktail party. Is there anything in your research that that really shocked you or alarmed or outraged you?
There were. Sadly, I was researching this during the pandemic, so there were no cocktail parties at which I could share these things with my friends, but I'll do it tonight. I think something that shocked me is a consistent theme in this book of people telling Juul what you're trying to do is a bad idea, and Juul deciding to do it anyway. And I think the best example, or the worst example, depending on your perspective, is this program they designed to actually go into schools and teach children an anti-vaping curriculum. And they did this because they were getting dragged through the press for addicting teenagers to their product. So they decided that the best way to combat that would be to actually go to the source and teach kids about why they shouldn't be vaping. And that's kind of a crazy idea, but especially because big tobacco companies had done this before and gotten a ton of flack for it. And the studies have come out and shown that that actually made kids look more favorably upon smoking because they were familiar with the brands.
Right.
And experts told Juul all of this. They told them, this is a horrible idea. You shouldn't do it. It's suicidal. And Juul did it anyway. They went ahead and pitched schools and actually paid a few to offer this curriculum. So that was one thing that I couldn't sort of fathom how that happened.
And do you think they were deeply sourced in the history of or in tobacco industry history? Do you think they understood what they were doing, or did they just stumble across these strategies on their own?
Well, so something that did come out in my research is that the two founders, when they were at school at Stanford and putting together the thesis project that would eventually become Juul, they actually looked to old tobacco industry documents to help them kind of understand how the industry worked and how previous products had been sold. So I know that they knew something about the tobacco industry, and arguably enough to have made better choices. But with that said, they were really fixated on this idea of being the opposite of big tobacco. They wanted to disrupt this industry. And so they didn't actually hire that many people who had worked at traditional tobacco companies so that they could say, look, we're different, we're the alternative to this industry. And I think that did them a disservice because they didn't have a ton of people in-house who really understood how carefully you have to follow FDA guidance and how bad things can go if you make a mistake. And I think maybe if they'd had some more institutional knowledge, they could have avoided some of these things.
Right. And yet they've been acquired by Altria has bought a significant share of the company, has it not?
Altria, yes. So Altria is the company that owns or operates Philip Morris, which in turn owns Marlboro. And they have paid $12.8 billion for 35% of Juul. So I think that made a lot of people's eyebrows go up when that happened, because if this is a company that's out to make the cigarette obsolete, it seems really confusing to then take all that money from a tobacco company. And they justify it by saying that this was a company that already had relationships with smokers, so it would help them get the product in front of the right people. And there probably is some truth to that, but I think it dragged down their reputation to a point where I think a lot of people were no longer willing to take them seriously after that happened.
Right. So if you were the benign monarch who could
I like to start to the question. Okay.
And we can nominate you. We can start a political action committee in Iowa. But if it were up to you to determine a way to control the market or regulate the market so that if not unalloyed, if the demonstrable good this product can do were allowed to be able to do its good, and the demonstrable bad could somehow be eliminated, what would you do? Would this best be acquired by prescription from a doctor? Would it, be sales limited only to people? Well, they're already limited by age, I assume. What would be the ways that this could be regulated so that it could do its medical good, getting people off of cigarettes, while not doing its medical bad, getting people onto nicotine?
I think the prescription model is interesting, and that is actually an option. If Juul wanted to apply for a different sort of FDA approval, they could kind of go down that road. I think there are some drawbacks to a prescription model because obviously you have to seek out that prescription, and that's going to cut off a decent number of people who might use it. But it would also completely eliminate the youth issue, or drastically reduce it. So it might be worth it for them to do that. I also think one interesting element of the story is that the FDA was really playing catch up on this whole industry. They didn't start regulating e-cigarettes until Juul and others had already been on the market for several years. And I guess if I'm a benign monarch who can also go back in time, I would say that none of these products should have hit the market before there were FDA rules on the books to kind of determine how they were sold and to sort through some of these questions about whether they're better for you or worse for you than cigarettes. So I think that could have made a load of difference just in how the data is interpreted. If you already had an FDA decision and sort of regulators had done the hard work of poring over the data, I think that could have gone a long way. But instead they were allowed to proliferate before anybody had taken that hard look.
And why did the FDA? I would think this is right in the FDA strike zone. I mean, this is right down the middle for them. Why didn't they swing at this?
You would think that. What happened is they didn't actually get the ability to regulate any tobacco product until 2009, which is sort of wild. And at that time, there were a couple e-cigarettes on the market in the US, but really not a lot. And they were kind of fringe and they weren't used by that many people. And from what I learned, people in the FDA kind of said, we don't really understand what these are and we don't think they're going to be a big deal. And we're going to wait. We're going to kind of get at the low hanging fruit first, and then we'll come back to these new things. And the FDA takes a very long time to make any policies. So by the time it became clear that these were something they should be thinking about, it was almost too late. They were everywhere.
Right. Is Silicon Valley capable of turning out a product that doesn't at some point at least flirt with evil? I mean, that's a broad way of putting it, but it does seem that companies that begin with the ethos, with the motto, don't be evil, turn into these behemoths who betray that initial dictum.
Is it possible? Sure. I'm sure it's possible. I do think though there's this track record of companies. I mean, it's like a trope in books now that there's these companies that come out with a great idea and everybody jumps on board and gives them money, and then as the money starts flowing in, all of a sudden the growth starts to take priority over the ideals. And I don't know what the antidote to that is, because companies obviously need money and investors to get off the ground, but it does seem like it just, once boards start to get involved and there's people who really care about the bottom line, that does seem to start to take priority.
Right.
And one interesting thing in the Juul story is, I think just last year, after all of the criticism against them and after they'd kind of fallen from grace, the company actually decided to move its headquarters from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. to kind of get away from this reputation of move fast and break things and the Silicon Valley curse. And I wonder if it might have been different if they hadn't come up in that atmosphere. I don't know, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah. Wow. Has anything changed about the company since they moved, aside from their mailing address?
Well, they're under new leadership. The two founders are actually both no longer with the company, and they both left. And the CEO, who is currently there, came from Altria, the tobacco company.
Right.
And he, by all accounts, is straight-laced and very careful with what he says and tries to stay out of the press and just wants to kind of keep his head down and get the company on the right track. So I would say there are differences in the way they've operated. They voluntarily took their flavored products off the market because those seem to be the ones that teenagers were using the most.
Right.
They are very rarely in the media unless they have to be. Like they don't comment really on stories. So I think they're sort of doing now what they should have done 5 years ago, I would say. But the question is whether it's too late and if they can ever kind of overcome that reputation.
Right. And they're no longer with the company. So Altria now, you said Altria now essentially runs the company.
Essentially, I mean, this guy no longer works at Altria. He's a Juul employee, but some of the very topmost employees at the company came from Altria, and it basically, the vibe within the company, from what I could tell, is it feels like a little offshoot of Altria. It's no longer, the fun Silicon Valley startup that was Juul. It's kind of guys in suits who really follow the letter of the law, which one could argue it always should have been. But
following the law always seems like a good idea.
Plus, it is a plus.
It is a plus. Well, there have to be questions I have not thought to ask you. So what is there a message you want to get across? Is there an idea you want to get across about sort of the larger philosophical question that this book raises about capitalism and good intentions gone wrong?
Yeah, I think what I tried to do in the book, I tried to show, I mean, this is what you try to do in all journalism, but I did try to show both sides, because I think, as I said before, so much of the media coverage about Juul has focused on the teenagers getting addicted, and that's important. I'm not trying to downplay that is a problem and something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be covered. But I do think in all the sort of panic about that, people lost sight of the fact that this is a product that could have done some good and still can, arguably. And I just think one of the interesting questions in the book is sort of, is this a story of missed opportunity more than a story of, an evil company? Is it? And I think the answer is probably yes, that the company just was mismanaged and made a lot of mistakes and got in over its head and sort of spun out of control. But that's what I really tried to show in the book, is it's not necessarily that people were kind of scheming to get kids addicted to nicotine. It was just a series of mistakes that, sunk the company, got kids hooked, and really sort of overshadowed what good could have come from Juul and other e-cigarettes.
Right.
That's my message.
That's your message. It's a good question. I mean, it's a good message. One last thing I wanted to ask you on a more personal level. What's the experience been like for you? This is your first book. You have a starred review from Publishers Weekly. You have a starred review from Kirkus. That is an extraordinary achievement, especially for a first book. How have you been handling this initial burst of terrific success?
Well, thank you, Jeff, for saying that. I will be honest, I was terrified before it came out. I was so anxious for weeks just about, I'd worked on it for more than a year. So the idea of having it actually out in the world and people reading it, it was scary. And it's so different than writing an article and, you work on it for a month or two and then it's out. And most people who read it in the first day and you kind of know how it's landed.
Right.
And a book is so different. It's like a much slower burn.
Yeah.
But it's been wonderful. I mean, I never expected any of this to happen. I started covering this topic for Time largely by accident. It was just something that was in the news a lot and we thought we should look into it. And then it sort of took on a life of its own. So it's been a wild ride.
It's a good ride. It's an exciting ride.
This is a good segue to talk about your book, because you have written many books and know much more about this than I do. And I would love to hear about. So for those who don't know, Jeff is a journalist at Time and has written more than 10 nonfiction books, right?
Yes, 10 nonfiction, 3 novels.
Okay. But this is your first adult fiction.
My first adult fiction. The other 2 were young adult fiction. That's right.
So why? I mean, why switch from nonfiction and take on adult fiction?
Well, the young adult fiction was sort of magical realism. And one of the things I really enjoyed about that, this from being a journalist, especially a science journalist, when you're a journalist, everything has to be factual. When you're a science journalist, things have to be uber factual because everything is empirical. When you're writing magical realism, you don't even have to obey the laws of physics. I can make anything happen that I want to happen. So I enjoyed that. But what I was looking for, I wanted to write adult fiction. And what I was looking for, it was a premise that could be stated on a post-it note. So when I could say, this book is about an astronaut who refuses to come home from the International Space Station. I had my premise, I had my idea. Now all I needed was 128,000 words that explained why she didn't want to come home from the International Space Station and what her motivation was. Yeah, just that 128,000 words. Happily, through a lot of the research I've done for my other books, for Time's Emmy Award-winning Year in Space series, I've gotten to visit a lot of the places that I write about in the book. I've been to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. I've been to the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Moscow and Moscow Mission Control. I've been in our Mission Control in Houston. I've been at Canaveral. So I've been immersed in a lot of this basic research for the last 3 decades of writing and reporting this. So that made it a great deal easier, because all of that sort of foundational work, that skeletal work you have to do when you're building the armature of a story, the factual armature of a story, I already had. Now I simply had to, I'm going to mix my metaphor here, working with a metal armature, I had to embroider a story around it, and I had to create the characters and sort of invent this world in which this woman does this improbable thing and changes the world in doing it.
So one of the things that does come across so strongly in the book is how much you know about space. I mean, I don't know a lot about space, and I felt like I was on the International Space Station. Like, it's the prose is so vivid and the terminology so specific. Did you let yourself take any creative liberties, or did you really make sure that this was as accurate as though it were nonfiction?
I tried to make it as accurate as if it were nonfiction. What I didn't want to do was be called on anything that would be a flagrant mistake. I will not call out other books that have done this or other movies that have done this, but there's some wonderful space movies that I've seen, and I've seen more than once, and they made me wince because there were physics problems in it, there were scientific problems in it, there were things that if you knew anything about it, you would have to reject the entire premise of the movie, because what was happening in the movie simply couldn't happen. You needed a certain level of technical knowledge to do that. And the movies in this case were so very good that I was able to overlook that. I don't want to be busted by people who know as much as space junkies like me do. So I was very careful to keep the architecture of the space station and the function of the space station as accurate as I could. What was a little bit harder was the second half of the book, or the other half of the book takes place in the Amazon, in the tribal regions in the Amazon. And I had to do a lot more basic research on that, because I had no fund of knowledge about the Guarani tribe, and that's the tribe that I mostly focus on in this book. And I had no real sense of how Brazilian government works, and how a Brazilian, sort of devastation of the Amazon, how that would play out. So I had to do a lot more sort of virgin research there and learn about that. So that part of the book was harder to write. Once I got back up in space, I felt quite literally and metaphorically weightless again.
So was the space infrastructure, if you will, was that what came first, or did the plot line of Wally Beckwith steals the space station, did that pop into your head fully formed, or was it kind of little by little that you put all of this together?
Wally Beckwith stealing the space station popped into my head very early. That was the premise. I borrowed the name Beckwith from one of our former colleagues at Time Magazine,
I
Ryan.
wondered if you had.
I had, and I asked him, I said, you have a perfectly crisp, perfectly literary surname. I promise I will do honor to the family escutcheon if you will let me use your surname. And he said yes. And interestingly, Wally, in the first chapter of the book, was a man. It was Wally. And I wrote the first chapter of the book, and I was already losing interest in my lead character because it just seemed like such a guy thing to do. It seemed like such a cowboy thing to do, to take over the space station. So happily, there was nothing terribly gender specific in the first chapter. All I had to do was go through and change the name Wally with a Y to Wally with an I, and change my pronouns. And then from that moment on, the book changed radically. The character diverged radically. The relationships diverged radically. And I think it became a much richer book for making Wally a woman, and, you know, sort of facing some of the challenges a woman would face in the space program and in the sciences in general.
That's fascinating. So did you, I'm just thinking this through, you wrote the first chapter and then you did all of the character development from there? Like how, I've never written fiction. So I'm curious how this comes together and how much of it you plan in advance and how much you kind of see where it goes on the page.
Well, it's some of it just develops on the page. Sometimes I just need an interesting character, a goofy character, a mean-spirited character, a courageous character to walk into a scene and say something or do something. And once that character is there, he or she either becomes just a cameo, a supernumerary, or will stick around. And I'll think, I like this guy, Raymond, I just invented. I like this woman, Mia, I just invented. I think I'd like to get to know her more. An important lesson I learned, though, when I was writing my first novel is starting a chapter of a novel, or even a nonfiction book for that matter, but especially a novel. It's like going into the Iraq War. Never go in without an exit strategy. You have to go into a chapter knowing how you want to end that chapter, knowing where you want to be when that chapter is done. Now, the actual writing might take you to a different place. You might think you're going to wind up at point A and wind up at point M instead, but you have to go in with a sense of, this is what I'm setting out to accomplish in the next 5,000 words. That, I think, gives me focus and clarity, and, you know, sort of helps me have some direction as I go through it.
Jeff, it's these insights that make me miss sitting next to you in an office.
I know, this is what our viewers here don't know. Jamie is directly to my right in our office, and we have not been there since March of 2020. This is just too much.
I've missed out on a year of Jeff Kluger's writing insights. But I do see our chat is filling up. So Elizabeth, should we take some questions?
Yes, let's do so. I've been keeping an eye. We've got some good ones rolling in. I'm going to scroll back up here and we'll start off with that. The first question for you is, Joanna asks, Jamie, what made you decide to write a book about this? You mentioned that you had seen a bunch of stuff in the news and you considered writing an article, and it rolled out from there. But did you cover it at Time? What about it made you say, hey, there's enough for a book here?
Yeah, so I started covering Juul in 2018 for Time, and we started, as I said, largely by accident. This was when it was really starting to take off among high schoolers. And we were just starting to hear, you know, kids are using this, kids seem to be getting addicted. Parents don't quite know what this is yet for the most part. Teachers are a little confused. You know, we should kind of do an explainer type story. And I thought that would just be a one-off piece, but we got a huge response to it. A lot of parents wrote in, and, you know, we felt like there was enough interest in the topic to keep an eye on it. So I became the person who kept an eye on Juul for the next couple of years, and a lot ended up happening between the big tobacco investment and the FDA crackdowns and all of this stuff. And I had been covering it mostly from the health and science perspective because that's what I do at Time. But there were so many interesting angles that I couldn't quite fit into my stories. The rise and fall of the company itself from a business perspective, the characters of the two founders and the people that they brought on at the company. There were just so many different ways to tell the story. And I felt like a book was kind of the only way that I could get at all of those.
Excellent. So let's ask our next question here. How did they come up with the name Juul? It looks so much like juvenile, is what Matthew here says.
I could not get a straight answer about that. Nobody seems to have a great recollection. I've not heard the juvenile comparison. That's interesting. I've heard, the unit of energy, a joule, has been thrown out as one possibility. Somebody else told me it just kind of looked cool, like it looked nice on the page, so they went with it. But no, I could not get a straight answer about where that came from, which if anybody finds out the answer, I would love to know.
That actually ties neatly in with some of the other questions that we've had. How did you get your sources to reveal so much about the company? Did you encounter a lot of people who just didn't want to talk to you? And has there been much of a response from the company about the book?
Yes, it was somewhat difficult to get people to open up for a few reasons. One being that pretty much anyone who leaves Juul signs a non-disclosure agreement when they leave. So that was one very tangible obstacle. But also this company had just gotten so much bad press that I think people are kind of tired of talking about it if they worked at the company, and they're tired of being associated with that. So it was a process. I would say the kind of turning point is I found one source who was willing to talk to me and to share some of their experiences. And then they were willing to introduce me to somebody they'd worked with. And that just sort of set off a domino effect where once I found one person who thought I was somewhat trustworthy and worthy of speaking to, that made it a lot easier to kind of get the next person. But I would say that was the most difficult part of reporting the book, because there were so many things that I couldn't know because I wasn't there, and I was really relying on the right sources to be willing to speak with me, and that was a long process. I sent a lot of LinkedIn messages that went unanswered and tracked down a lot of personal email addresses and did that work for a really long time. And now I've forgotten the second half of the question.
Has there been any response from the company? And have you been able to get a hold of the founders, or did they not want to talk to you?
I had interviewed both of the founders and the old CEO through my reporting at Time. So some of that is in the book, but they unfortunately did not agree to be interviewed again for the book. And the response from the company so far, I mean, I haven't gotten anything official from Juul, but I have heard from some people who worked there who said that the book was very true to their experience. And they thought kind of hit on the major points of being a Juul employee. So that was really nice to hear, because that's obviously the ultimate compliment to get from somebody who actually lived this story.
That's a pretty great compliment to get, especially, I mean, it's such a contentious product. So someone asked if you came across something called buzz testing in your research, which, when I asked for clarification, says that the founders used early employees as lab rats by having them test early models for the nicotine buzz, which early beginning smokers apparently get quite a buzz from that first cigarette. Did you come across any of those kinds of stories? Because
I did. Yeah. That isn't when Jeff asked me what made my eyes pop out a little bit. That was my second choice of answer to talk about. So I'm glad that we're doing it now. But yes, this reader is correct. When the founders were mixing up the original formula for Juul, which is a mixture of nicotine and an acid and some sort of like carrier agents, they decided that the best way to figure out the winning mixture would be to buzz test it, which is exactly what it sounds like. They would drag on a Juul and then they would rate the mixtures based on how much of a buzz they got and how potent they were. And that is troubling for a couple reasons. One is it's probably not a great idea to test a product on your employees who are, have a stake in continuing to get their paycheck and perhaps don't feel that they can say no to that request. And also, I heard from some sources who just felt like that was a really concerning way to land on the formula, because yes, you need it to be potent enough that it matches a cigarette and that people get the nicotine that they're used to. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want something that will give you a buzz, because that makes it more habit forming. So one of the criticisms that Juul gets frequently is that they could have done the same thing or almost the same thing with a lower concentration of nicotine, and then perhaps fewer people would have gotten addicted. So that's one of the big themes that's explored in the book as well.
All right. So there's some kind of technically questions here. Someone says, as an ex-smoker, I cannot stand being around any of that stuff. I do wonder, smokers often lose some of their sense of smell. Do people who vape also lose some of their sense of smell?
It's a good question. I have not come across that in my research. What I will say is that the smell and the taste of an e-cigarette is much mellower than a cigarette. That's sort of one of their selling points, is that the vapor dissipates really quickly. So you could use it, like step outside of your office for a second and then just go back inside and you won't smell like smoke. So my guess, but again, I don't know for sure, is that that's less of an issue. But that would be an excellent topic for a study that some scientists should do.
I used to work around a lot of smokers in one of my early jobs, and they would come in from their smoke breaks and wash their hands and chew some gum, and they'd think they were fine. And it was like, we can smell it on you. And when they would quit smoking, and so, because some of them would, they would be astonished when their still smoking coworkers would come in and they'd be like, you can smell it. Like, yes, we can. We weren't just making, we weren't just being saucy about it. We really could smell it. So I would be very interested to find out if it did still affect their sense of smell. And then someone also asks, does the rise in vaping have any measurable improvement on the number of fires started by cigarettes?
Wow, these are such good questions that I did not come across in my research. I would guess yes. Again, I don't know, but I mean, their whole thing is that they don't actually burn anything. It just warms up this nicotine mixture. So other than those very scattered reports of e-cigarettes exploding in people's pockets, which seems to have not been a thing for a few years, I don't think that they are involved in any fires.
All right. Well, that's good. Jeffrey, here's a question for you. Is it more fun to write nonfiction or fiction, or young adult or adult? Any kind of crossover mix? What's the most fun?
I think the most fun is fiction, and it's equally fun to write for young adults as well as for adults. I think there's a certain liberation in writing fiction. There's a certain freedom to go where the narrative carries you. And often the narrative carries you to a place you didn't think it was going to take you. There in my very first novel, which is set in the 19th century in a place sort of like Ireland, but I didn't name it Ireland because I knew I could never study deeply enough about Ireland to pretend to be an authoritative writer about Ireland. So I just made it similar to Ireland. But there were incidental characters that I introduced, and some of them would turn into, instead of a 1-paragraph description, it would turn into, a 4,000-word storyline, because the creative experience just took me there. You can't do that in nonfiction. You can't invent as you go. So that's called falsification, and that's a death penalty offense in journalism. So I find fiction more liberating than nonfiction, and young adult fiction and adult fiction I find equally satisfying.
Matthew asks, with all the information available out there about space and military, how can governments possibly keep anything secret?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, I am working on a story for Time now that I hope will get me out to visit with the folks at Space Force and in Space Command. I think the government is exceedingly good at keeping secrets, although I also find it fascinating that as early as 2 weeks from now, the government is prepared to release a report on what we no longer call UFOs, we call UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. That's what they're called. So we are finally going to be releasing information on UAPs and trying to determine exactly what it is the military is seeing. I think the government is still very good at keeping things exceedingly confidential, but when they want a story out there, they do a very good job of promoting it, which we see NASA do that very well. Space Command is very forthcoming with Space Command and Space Force are very forthcoming because they are a new agency and they're trying to, win the public trust. So I think you're going to be seeing more and more sort of clarity and candor coming from the government on these issues.
Speaking of clarity and candor, Dennis asks, given your years in the business, what are your thoughts on the attacks on the First Amendment in the last 5 years, and how do we, as Americans, hold the line on these infringements?
Well, I think we hold the line on these infringements by continuing to speak out, by continuing to publish, by continuing to write. The attacks on the First Amendment unfortunately often come from people who don't fully understand what the First Amendment is. You will hear people say that, say, Facebook deleting certain kinds of posts is a First Amendment issue. Well, it's not a First Amendment issue because it's not the government deleting posts. It's a private company deleting posts. A private company has the freedom to do what it wants, to edit what it wants, to publish what it wants. It's the government that raises First Amendment issues. I think it has been, even with as polarized as a political system as we have, with the three major left, center, and right networks, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, even with the shooting war among all three of those networks, I think the fact that the conversation is as loud and robust and sometimes inelegant and sometimes overheated, I think it's a sign of a healthy democracy that we are still able and willing to shout at one another and sometimes come to agreement.
Excellent. So to go back to your space, can you smoke in space? Tell me why. I mean, one ought not to, in general, introduce fire into an enclosed atmosphere like an International Space Station. So can astronauts smoke at all?
Astronauts cannot smoke, although there's some it's shocking footage from the late 1950s when the first 7 astronauts, the original 7 astronauts, were introduced, and they were introduced with great fanfare, and they're sitting at a dais, and there's cameras everywhere, and these are 7 perfect specimens of American manhood, and they're all going to be astronauts, they're all going to be spacemen. And while they are at their press conference, 4 of them have ashtrays in front of them, and 4 of these astronauts are smoking during their press conference. So in the early days of the space program, nobody gave any thought at all to astronaut smoking. Smoking in space is a perfectly terrible idea, especially in the era in which the atmosphere in a spacecraft was 100% pure oxygen, because that has the flammability of gasoline. So you very much don't want to light a match. And even
vape in space, the big question.
Vaping would be a very different thing. That's true. You could vape in space. You might be an unpopular spaceman if the people around you weren't vaping, but vaping in space would be a safe, if perhaps ill-advised thing to do.
There you have it.
What I was curious. I know that, it seems you're trapped. Like there's nowhere to go. If a fire happens, that's game over.
Yes.
So I'm glad to see that science backs that up and that I was right there. So I'm going to give myself 50 points. Jamie, here's another question for you. Kathleen says, I often show aspiring young writers or journalists your LinkedIn page, which illustrates your pathway. It's very exciting for those students. Did you ever have a moment of doubting your focus and think you wanted to go in another direction? And what kept you on the writer's journey?
That is so kind. I'm touched by this, and I wish that I had a story of going back to the writer's journey. But in fact, I was one of the weird kids who always knew exactly what they wanted to do, and I would make fake magazines when I was a kid and like write fake headlines. So I went into college pretty sure that this was what I wanted to do, and I stuck to it. But what I will say is the job search can be very disheartening. Unfortunately, there are not as many jobs in writing as there once were. And that was a real sort of test of how much I wanted it. And I think what I always tell people who ask me about going into this industry is if you think about what you want to do and you can't think of a single other thing, then it's worth it. And you just have to apply to all of those jobs and keep sending cover letters and keep getting rejected for pitches, and eventually something will work out. But yeah, it can be tough, but it also can be done.
Jeffrey, you write fiction? Jamie, you do not. Jeffrey, have your characters taught you anything?
My characters taught me anything. My first character in a book I originally wrote, my first novel, I originally wrote, the title was Lake Ship. One word, Lake Ship. I wrote it as a novel for adults. And then when it was sold as a novel for young adults, the title instead became Nacky Patcher and the Curse of the Dry Land Boats. So this tells you something about marketing between the two. But the idea for that story occurred to me in a dream. I dreamt about, I had an image of a lake and a mountain that was just clear from shore to shore. And then I passed over the lake again, and it was covered with the deconstructed remains of a great clipper ship, of a great sailing ship. And I woke up and thought, well, what an interesting premise. How could a clipper ship, a great sailing ship, find its way up into a mountain lake, and break apart into its 40,000 constituent pieces? And what would happen if the people in the village built the boat? So the lead character, who decides that he believes that something mystical is happening and chooses to lead his village in building this boat, taught me something. And what he taught me was, if the vision is improbable, if the goal seems impossible, the commitment to doing it is still an imperative, and try to see it through, try to get it done. And every other book I've written since then, when I've been in that position of thinking, I cannot believe I have to write this book now, I simply do it a day at a time, 1,000 words at a time. And I follow sort of the dictum of Nacky Patcher from that book.
Excellent. So we're going to end on just one more question. I'm going to ask each of you, what are you reading for pleasure right now? I know each of you were reading each other's books. So what you are reading next, I will leave our audience with the note that both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Big Vape is in our store now. And if you order from us and ask us in the order comments to please hold the book for Jamie, she will be coming in a week or so to sign books for us. So we're very happy to do that. And Jeffrey's book, Holdout, is newly releasing in just a few weeks, and we are happily taking pre-orders. Pre-orders are one of the best ways to convince a publisher to spend more of their marketing dollars on that book. So pre-orders are great, and Jeffrey would love if you pre-ordered Holdout. Jamie, Jeffrey, what are you planning on reading next for your own personal enjoyment?
I am actually switching off between Holdout and a book called We Ride Upon Sticks, which is about a magical field hockey team in Danvers, Massachusetts. And this spoke to me for several reasons. One, being from New England. Two, I played field hockey in high school. And three, it just seemed like the perfect thing to read during a pandemic when you're tired of, reading the news. So I highly recommend that if you need just something very fun and inventive during the pandemic.
And I am going back and forth between Big Vape and Joe Lelyveld's book on the final year in the life of Franklin Roosevelt. I am an FDR junkie. If there's a book about Roosevelt, I read it. And this is a fascinating story about a man who knew he was at the end of his life. He knew he was dying, and he knew in that last year he still had to kind of save the world. And it's a fascinating story of a fascinating man.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the two of you for joining me. We again are joined this evening by Jamie Ducharme, whose new book, Big Vape, The Incendiary Rise of Juul, is newly out. And we are also joined by Jeffrey Kluger, whose upcoming book, his novel, is Holdout. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to our audience members for joining us remotely as well. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.